In the spring of 1996, a demolition crew was dispatched to the outer edges of Cumberland County, Rhode Island, where the forest deepens into a thicket of ash trees and granite shelves. It was there, buried beneath decades of overgrowth and silence, that the remains of Hallowmere Orphanage stood, or rather, leaned. The structure was skeletal by then, with ivy choking its stonework and wild moss softening its collapsing stairwells. The building had not been touched since 1959. Developers had recently secured permits to convert the site into a planned community of family homes and recreational trails. Hallowmere, once a whisper among local school children and a black mark on municipal ledgers, had finally been scheduled for erasure. The crew, contracted out of Cranston, arrived with heavy machinery, ready to tear through a forgotten past and lay foundations for something new. But on the second day of work, as the men stripped away the chapel's rotting floorboards, foreman Rick Lathrop struck something unexpected. Wedged deep within the stone base of the altar wall, a space sealed on all sides, was a dry, unmarked cavity lined with scrap cloth. Inside, cushioned in the dust, was a small envelope. It had no postage, no return address, only a name, scrawled in faint graphite with a child's uneven hand, Miriam. Inside, one sheet, lined paper, the kind used in classrooms of the era, faded but intact. The writing, printed in block capitals, read, "Please don't let them take my name again." Signed simply, Miriam. The letter was dated October 12, 1957. The discovery was dismissed at first as the strange remnant of a child's imagination, a note tucked away decades earlier during a game of hide-and-seek perhaps. But something about the envelope felt off. The paper was dry. The ink hadn't run. The envelope was folded twice and sealed with a perfect crease, preserved in a wall that had been closed since the Eisenhower administration. Lathrop, uneasy, passed the letter to the site supervisor. Within hours it reached the Cumberland Historical Commission, and by the following week, demolition had halted, pending an archival investigation. Hallowmere Orphanage had always existed in the footnotes of Rhode Island's institutional history. Established in 1919, it began as a philanthropic response to a typhoid outbreak that left dozens of children parentless in the northern corridor of the state. Over the years, it passed through the hands of several private operators, Catholic charities, Protestant missions, even a short-lived state partnership, before being quietly shuttered in the winter of 1959. What raised eyebrows wasn't its closure, but how little was left behind. There were no complete personnel rosters, no intake logs after 1956. State audits were missing. Even the town tax rolls listed the property as Dormant Youth Facility number 12, with no contact information, no point of oversight. A 1960 memo from the State Department of Human Services labelled Hallowmere simply as defunct, no further action required. It wasn't until the letter appeared that anyone questioned why. Local journalists began digging through microfilm, and what they found was a threadbare trail of clipped reports and ambiguous citations. The Providence Herald had run a short piece in May of 1959, Hallowmere Orphanage closes due to budget discrepancies. No mention of the children, no explanation of where they had gone. A year earlier, in October of 1958, the same paper published a one-column obituary. Miss Ellen Rythe, 61, passed suddenly at her place of employment, Hallowmere Home for Children. Cause of death, accidental fall from the chapel bell tower. The article included no further details, no mention of witnesses, no funeral announcements, no family inquiries. But it was the line beneath it that prompted further scrutiny. A single sentence, unrelated but printed directly beneath the obituary's closing line: "The home will suspend public visitations for winter renovation." There were no winter renovations. By the third week of investigation, a retired school teacher named Emmeline Marr contacted the commission. Now 84, she claimed to have volunteered at Hallowmere for 2 summers during college, in 1955 and 1956. Her testimony, taken at a senior care home in Warwick, was detailed, lucid, and troubling. There were never more than 20 children at any given time, she recalled, but they didn't call them by name, just numbers. I remember asking where Annalise had gone, and the head nurse looked at me like I'd made a mistake. "That's subject 8, she said. Ma described long periods of silence, mandatory, quiet sessions, children made to sit in straight-back chairs facing blank walls, rewards given for stillness, punishments for speaking without permission. You'd hear them humming, she added, but not real songs, just one tone held together, all of them at once, like they were practicing something. The letter, "Please don't let them take my name again," took on a new weight. Archived correspondence between local parishes revealed that Hallowmere had, by 1955, severed ties with most outside charities. One 1956 letter from a Reverend Colby of St Anne's Episcopal Church read, "We can no longer in good conscience fund a facility that restricts spiritual guidance and prohibits name-based instruction. The refusal to refer to children by their God-given names is both unnatural and inhumane." The note was ignored, no reply was documented. By 1957, Hallowmere had become its own island. It accepted no donations, no visitors, and according to town records, received no food shipments. But county utility logs showed steady electrical use, high even, and water consumption above average for a residential facility. Something had been operating, something self-contained. A week after the demolition was postponed, a second item was recovered. Hidden in the crawl space beneath the east wing, a rusted tin lunchbox contained 24 strips of paper, all the same kind used in public schools of the 1950s. On each strip, a name crossed out with a thick black line. No last names, just Anna, Jonas, Lucy, Miriam, Thomas. Only one remained untouched, at the bottom of the box, still crisp and folded in half. It read, Subject 3. A state historian reviewing the materials remarked, "This wasn't just neglect, it was erasure." To this day, no official ledger has been found documenting the final 2 years of Hallowmere's operation. The state has no record of where the children went. There are no graduation records, no adoption certificates. Inquiries to local families returned nothing. It was as though, beginning in 1957, Hallowmere ceased to report its children, not because they had left, but because their identities no longer existed in a way the state recognised. The children weren't lost, they were unmade. What makes this story particularly chilling is not the presence of overt violence or even visible suffering. It is the quietness of it, the bureaucracy of evil. Hallowmere did not burn, it did not implode. It was not raided by police or shuttered in scandal. It was erased by the passage of time and the silence of paper. Its most horrifying act may have been nothing more than a file never written, a form never filed, a name never spoken again. In the pursuit of control, of perfect obedience, Hallowmere crossed a line few institutions dare acknowledge, the deliberate disassembly of identity. When the demolition project was officially cancelled in November of 1997, the site was left to the forest. No marker was placed, no memorial stone installed. The foundation was declared unsafe for visitation, and the land was quietly rezoned as non-commercial. Hallowmere remains, its stonework now blanketed in moss and shadow. As for the letter, "Please don't let them take my name again," it sits in a temperature-controlled drawer at the Cumberland County Historical Archive. The handwriting has been analysed, catalogued, and preserved. But Miriam has never been found, because in the records that remain, there was never a Miriam at Hallowmere, only Subject 3. In early April of 1951, following the sudden closure of the Caraway Juvenile Observation Ward in Providence, 12 children were quietly relocated under a transfer agreement that left no public trace. No media coverage marked the closure. No court orders were filed. The only record was a small packet of intake forms filed under transfer intake in spring 1951, stored in a state archive box labelled with a fading stamp. For review, deferred. All 12 children were between 6 and 13 years old. The diagnoses attached to their files were vague, medicalised euphemisms drawn from the lexicon of post-war psychiatry: attachment dysregulation, habitual resistance, moral insubordination. No criminal charges, no family records, no parent or guardian signatures. Just a single sentence on each form under custodial reason: behaviour incompatible with public institution environment. The destination listed on each file was Facility 42A. That designation would not appear on state maps or inspection records until 1964, long after the orphanage itself had been abandoned. But by cross-referencing electrical contracts and land use permits filed through a third-party maintenance vendor in 1951, it was confirmed. Facility 42A was the internal designation for Hallowmere Orphanage. The files themselves are incomplete. Several are missing intake photographs. Others have pages blacked out with heavy redaction ink, though redaction was not standard practice in Rhode Island mental health records at the time. 2 case numbers appear more than once, assigned to different children. One document is almost completely blank. Intake Form 11, submitted April 13, 1951, reads only: name reclaimed, age, origin withheld, assigned code 07. A note scribbled in the margin in blue pencil reads: requires modified environment, do not engage. It was the only form to contain no medical history. Among those investigating the letter found in the Hallowmere Chapel in 1996 was a state-appointed historian named Charles Renner. Renner, a former psychiatric archivist, began cross-referencing the Caraway ward's closure with mental health funding logs from the late 1940s. What he uncovered was a collapsed initiative known as the Providence Rehabilitation Cohort, a short-lived experimental program partially funded by the Department of Corrections and the Children's Psychological Research Institute of Boston. The goal of the program was simple on paper: to reintegrate children with severe behavioral issues through isolated observation and therapeutic stimulus control. In practice, it was anything but simple. The juvenile ward housing the program closed only 13 months after its launch. No public explanation was given. All remaining wards were reassigned. The program vanished from the budget the following fiscal year, but the children didn't vanish, they were moved. A nurse from the original Caraway facility, 92-year-old Agnes Tilford, came forward during the Hallowmere investigation. Her testimony, though limited by age, remains chilling in its clarity. She recalled the final week of the program. They lined the children up in the hallway, she said, but we weren't allowed to speak to them anymore. They didn't speak back. They'd stopped by then. Some of them wouldn't even look up. She remembered a man, not part of the regular staff. A visitor, she assumed. Sharp eyes, she said. That's what stuck with me. Not cold, just measuring. He didn't look at them like they were children. He looked at them like they were tools. In the Caraway intake logs, one physician is listed as consulting observer for the cohort's final month, Dr. Aldous R. Curl. After 1953, his name disappears from the public medical registry. His license was never revoked. There are no known obituaries, no further documentation. Dr. Curl had been the medical director of the cohort, and according to Tilford, he had requested one condition before the transfer. The children must not be addressed by name once relocated. The records from Hallowmere that follow the 1951 transfer are sparse, but energy usage at the facility increased significantly starting in June of that year. Water consumption tripled. Invoices filed by a private vendor show large orders of medical bedding, steel shelving units, and soundproof insulation panels. An internal memo from the Department of State Facilities, dated July 29, 1951, confirms the purchase of reinforced door frames for Wing B isolation chambers. There are no blueprints showing a Wing B at Hallowmere prior to 1951. Financially, the orphanage should not have survived. A 1954 audit reviewed in detail by the Cumberline Historical Commission, showed that Hallowmere was still receiving monthly stipends despite not reporting any adoptions, placements, or medical discharges. A 1955 state auditor's note, unsigned and buried in the margins of a budget summary, asked the question no one else seemed to. Why does this facility continue to receive funding with no discharge reports? That question was never answered. The funding continued for 4 more years. What makes this phase of the story particularly harrowing is its utter lack of noise. No protests, no leaks, no dramatic escapes or fire alarms. Just a system that folded children into itself and removed the language needed to ever speak of them again. The horror of Hallowmere was not its secrecy, but its paperwork, meticulously managed, deliberately incomplete, always just clean enough to avoid scrutiny. The children were not lost, they were processed, refiled, assigned codes. Their names erased not by force, but by procedure. By the end of 1951, the last surviving record linking the Caraway children to their original files had been destroyed in what was referred to as a clerical transfer fire, a term used internally to justify the loss of 116 patient folders across 3 departments. No fire was reported. The file cabinets, however, were emptied. With the reclassification of Hallowmere as Facility 42A, the intake process was complete. There were no more names, only numbers. The next year, Subject 3 would be assigned, and the story, the real story, would begin. By the spring of 1953, the name Hallowmere Orphanage had been effectively erased from Rhode Island's public records. In state ledgers, it no longer appeared under child welfare institutions. In inspection reports, it was referenced only by its new designation, Facility Number 42A. The transition was not announced. No statement was issued to explain the reclassification, and yet the change was reflected everywhere that mattered. School board allocations stopped, parish donations ceased, no additional children were assigned, but the children were still there. Residents of Hollows Crossing, the rural township 3 miles east of the facility, continued to report seeing them, always behind the gates, always in uniform, pale grey smocks, buttoned at the spine, loose at the arms. They were often seen walking the perimeter in small groups of 4, quiet, controlled, always supervised. The children never played. A postmaster named Vernon Halley, who delivered to the area between 1952 and 1957, submitted a written account to the Cumberline Commission decades later. He described a recurring pattern. Every Thursday at 4:15 p.m, he would pass the northern wall of the compound and see a group of children standing still in the courtyard. They weren't looking at anything, he wrote, just staring ahead. One time I waved. Not a single one moved. I thought maybe they were statues. Inside the facility, change had taken root. By late 1953, every original staff member had been dismissed. Former instructors, including 2 with early education licenses, were replaced with personnel listed as in-house observation specialists. None were required to have teaching certifications. A recovered personnel log from February 1954 notes the staff roster by function rather than title. 4 intake monitors, 3 behaviour recorders, 2 isolation supervisors, 1 response technician. There was no longer anyone labelled as teacher. Lesson plans were removed from the daily schedule and replaced with a new regimen, titled simply Conditioning Sequence, Phase 2. The revised schedule, discovered decades later inside a locked filing cabinet near the chapel stairwell, was as follows: 0500 Wake, 0600 Observe, 800 Structured Silence, Part 1, 1100 Meal, No Conversation, 1300 Isolate, 1600 Group Reflection, Eyes Forward, 1800 Structured Silence, Part 2, 2100 Report, 2200 Containment. There were no mentions of reading, no arithmetic, no arts, no playtime, no external correspondence. The children were no longer students. they were subjects. In 1955, the Department of Educational Facilities sent a single inspector to the site following a clerical dispute over unused textbook grants. The inspector, Louise Cardle, age 37, filed a short report upon her return. Most of it read like a checklist: building structurally sound, staff cooperative, dormitories clean. Only one line stood out: observation rooms are cold, no writing utensils visible. Cardell was not sent back. The complaint was marked not substantiated. That same year, a neighbouring landowner, Maynard Ellsworth, began keeping a journal of what he called the singing. Ellsworth lived on a 12-acre farmhouse bordering the southern edge of the Hallowmere property. His journal, preserved by his daughter, documents dozens of entries referring to sounds heard every Thursday evening between 6:30 and 7 o'clock p.m. June 2nd, 1955. Heard them again. No words, just the humming, all at once. They don't sing like kids. They don't stop. June 9th, 1955. Same time, same sound. One long note. It doesn't rise or fall. Just flat, empty. July 14th, 1955. Sounded like it came from under the building this time. Though he reported the sounds to the town constable, no action was taken. The journal ends abruptly in early 1956 with a final entry. They don't hum when it rains, just silence. Several recovered medical reports from that same period detail routine assessments conducted by the response technician. These reports include entries under a category labelled Compliance Behaviour Metrics. Each child was listed only by number. Subject 2 still fails to maintain visual fixation, extends silence training. Subject 7 wanders, instruct isolation supervisor to withhold dinner if error exceeds 4 seconds. Subject 3 meets minimum, avoids eye contact, displays mimicry when alone. Continue. There is no record of who compiled these notes, but the header of each report includes a familiar stamp: A.R. Keel, MD. The idea that a child could be raised in such a setting, not to learn, but to be observed, is disturbing. But the reality was even worse. At its core, Hallowmere had become an experiment in identity extraction. What makes this period in the orphanage's history especially horrifying is not the presence of brutality or abuse in the traditional sense. It was the absence of recognition, the removal of language, of reward, of individuality. These children were not punished into silence, they were raised in it. And silence became survival. In late 1956, a janitor named Clifford Lamy was employed for 6 weeks during the facility's boiler repairs. His employment was brief and terminated without formal cause, but his exit report, a handwritten page submitted to the maintenance company, provides one of the few first-hand accounts from inside facility number 42A during this era. "No child looked me in the eyes," Lamy wrote, "not once. They stared at the floor or stared past me, like they were waiting for something. I was told by a supervisor that meant they were progressing." He continued, "You don't hear laughter, no crying either, just footsteps and doors. They move when told, they stop when told. No one says anything." Lamy's final line reads, "I don't know what they're being trained for, but they aren't children anymore." By the end of 1956, Hallowmere had ceased to resemble any recognisable model of childcare. Its windows were blacked out, its playgrounds overgrown, its classrooms, once funded by public education grants, had been converted into reflection chambers, empty rooms with a single chair and a wall-mounted mirror. That same year, a school board member filed a motion to reallocate the orphanage's textbook budget to another county. The motion passed unanimously. No one asked why Hallowmere hadn't requested new books in nearly 4 years. With the conditioning program fully underway, the groundwork had been laid for the next phase, one that would no longer require education or nurturing or even human interaction. The silence was working, and in that silence, the damage was being done. The night of October 14th, 1956, was marked by a rare and violent storm that rolled in from the coast, tearing across Cumberland County with wind speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour. Trees snapped along Route 4, and power lines fell into flooded ditches. Most residents stayed indoors that evening, waiting out the thunder that seemed to sit low over the hills, echoing against the slate roofs of Hollows Crossing. But just after 9:30 p.m, a call was placed to the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department by a woman named Ruth Eddington. She lived alone on a property bordering the western tree line behind the Hallowmere facility. Her statement, recorded and preserved in the original dispatch log, read simply, "There's a child standing on the roof of the chapel, right at the peak, not moving, just standing there in the lightning." According to the call transcript, the dispatcher asked if the child appeared in distress. Eddington replied, "They aren't reacting. It's like they don't notice the storm at all." Two patrolmen, Deputy Hugh Blakely and Deputy James Coulter, were dispatched from the main station at 9:47 p.m. and arrived at the Hallowmere Gate 17 minutes later. The storm was still active. Branches littered the entrance. The iron gate had partially collapsed under a fallen oak, and both officers had to enter on foot through a break in the fencing. They reached the main building at 10:15 p.m. Their official report, filed 2 days later, described no visible movement upon arrival. The exterior grounds were deserted. Flashlights scanned the courtyard, the northern bell tower, and the slanted roof of the chapel. The figure was gone, but a window, third floor, rear-facing, east wing, had been shattered. From the inside, fragments of safety glass were found scattered along the overgrown hedgerow, with several embedded in the soil below. The officers noted no sign of forced entry. No alarm had been triggered. No one came to greet them. Deputy Coulter's final line in the report simply read, "No one answered the door. The building appeared occupied but inactive. Requested follow-up. No further action taken." The following morning, an internal incident report was filed from within the facility. It was unsigned, typed on a water-damaged Hallowmere header form, and marked for internal review only. That document was later recovered during a 1998 thermal scan analysis of Hallowmere's administrative archive. The original ink had faded beyond legibility, but under low-frequency thermal imaging, several lines re-emerged. The report referenced a subject, NOSHA 7, and the phrase, "reversal of expected behaviour." Compulsion breach during Phase 4 silence cycle. Reached third floor window during 2100 isolation. Another fragment, lower on the page, read, "Vocalization occurred, non-verbal, restraint initiated, containment reinforced." Facility logs from that week list Subject 7 as active through October 13th, but make no mention of the 14th. The log for the 15th, the day after the storm, skips Subject 7 entirely. The following week's records list a reassignment. Subject 7 is replaced with a new identifier, 11R. The R designation, according to a staff manual, recovered from a former employee's attic, stood for reconditioned. There are no further mentions of Subject 7 after that date. The chapel window, the one that had been broken, was sealed the next morning with a wooden plank and never repaired. A maintenance invoice filed on October 16th confirmed the replacement of a rear third-floor lock and the removal of foreign material from the window casing. The listed item, fabric, child's uniform, grey, damp. It was the only documented incident at Hallowmere that year. But for those watching from the outside, something had shifted. Maynard Ellsworth, the farmer who had documented the facility's Thursday evening humming, recorded in his journal the following entry. "No humming tonight. Maybe the storm spooked them, or maybe they were punished." 2 weeks later, the humming resumed, but according to Ellsworth, the tone had changed. It's lower now, slower, like they're waiting. What makes this particular event significant in the broader timeline of Hallowmere isn't simply the mystery of the child on the roof. It's what the event reveals. By 1956, the facility's children were no longer reacting to the world as children. They did not respond to storms. They did not speak. They did not cry. And in at least one case, a child chose the only act of rebellion left, to climb through a third-story window into a thunderstorm rather than remain in the room. Not to escape, but to stand still in the rain. It was not an attempt to flee, it was a demonstration, a break in programming, a signal. And like all breaks in conditioning at Hallowmere, it was followed by silence. The thematic horror of this moment is not found in the storm, or the shattered window, or even the pale silhouette glimpsed in the lightning. It lies in the institution's response. Nothing was investigated, no medical alert was filed, no family was contacted, because there were no families to contact. Subject 7 was not given help, they were reclassified, and the system moved on. It's worth noting that the chapel itself, the structure beneath where the figure had been seen, held no religious services by 1956. The pews had been removed, the altar had been stripped. Architectural records show that in 1954, the stained glass windows were covered with reinforced plasterboard for optical control. The entire third floor, including the chapel roof access, had been repurposed for what the documents referred to as behavioural tier containment. The space beneath the chapel had become something else entirely. In the months that followed, no further incidents were reported, but internal notes indicate that 3 more children were assigned R classifications before the year's end. Each had been part of the isolation cycle that included Subject 7. One note, attached to Subject 12's folder, stated, "Subject resists silent sequence, following visual exposure to tier containment breach. Introduce audio inversion protocol." Another note, dated December the 2nd, reads, 3 subjects displaying mimetic delay, proximity to 07R limited to 1.5 meters. Observation ongoing. The breach, as it was later referred to, had altered the program, but instead of dismantling it, the facility adapted. There was one final note recovered from the incident archive, a memo addressed not to staff, but to Dr. A.R. Curl directly. The header was marked private. The author remains unknown, but the message read, "Containment does not equal correction. The behaviour was not random. Consider the implications of Subject 7's exposure. What they see, they may teach. What they feel, they may remember." It was never answered. By the spring of 1957, the term containment breach was replaced in internal documents with a new phrase, identity reassertion. The children weren't escaping, they were remembering, and the system that had spent years trying to erase them was beginning to fracture. By the beginning of 1957, the facility once known as Hallowmere Orphanage no longer functioned under any recognisable institutional model. The building still stood, the staff remained on payroll, the state continued issuing routine allocations from the Child Welfare Development Fund, and reports were still being filed under Facility Number 42A. But the paper trail had begun to fray. It began with a transfer request, a routine audit form submitted to the Department of Child Welfare in Providence, requesting confirmation of discharge status for 10 unidentified minors listed only by numerical code. The response from the archive office arrived 2 weeks later in an unsealed envelope. Inside were 5 pages, all blank. The document showed no visible ink. When held under UV light, faint impressions revealed that the pages had been written on and then wiped, chemically or thermally, until only the indentations of the original keystrokes remained. The form header on the top sheet was partially legible. Internal file reference, DCF INM priority tier, high. Forensic analysis conducted in 1994, decades after the pages were recovered from a sealed evidence box, revealed several phrases reconstructed through indentation scanning and ink residue absorption. Among them, Subject 4 lost cohesion, names require further scrubbing, sustain containment, do not escalate to formal inquiry. The signature line was redacted not with ink, but with pressure. The name had been pressed so deeply into the paper and then abraded, leaving only a worn gouge in the lower margin. The files had been sent from the desk of a mid-level administrative officer named Cora Tillman, who left her position abruptly in April of that same year. Tillman's personnel record included no disciplinary history. Her resignation was filed under personal stress-related leave, and she was never interviewed in connection to the missing ink documents. But her name would resurface 32 years later. In 1989, a private historian named Andrew Bell conducted a series of recorded interviews with former custodial and clerical workers from decommissioned state facilities. The audio, recovered after Bell's death, was stored in unlabeled cassette cases in the basement of his home. One tape, dated April 5, 1989, contains the voice of a man identified only as Nolan. His voice, coarse and brittle, describes his time working at facility number 42A as a night custodian between late 1956 and early 1957. They told me not to clean the third-floor corridor, said it was sealed for repair, but the lights were always on, even when the rest of the building was dark. He pauses. Then, I heard him. Through the vents, not words, not even whispering really, just sounds, repeating, over and over, same tone, like they weren't trying to talk to each other, just remember something. Bell asks if the children were ever seen. Sometimes you'd catch a glimpse when the elevator doors opened. They'd be standing in a row, quiet, looking at the floor. They weren't moving, like they'd forgotten how. The tape ends with Nolan saying one more thing. You didn't ask questions, you just emptied the bins. One night I found a calendar in the trash room, one of those desk flip kinds. Every day crossed out in red, except Halloween. That day was circled in black. That calendar was recovered in 1997 during an off-record investigation into archival boxes mislabeled as hospital maintenance logs. The calendar, thin printed on yellowing cardstock, showed all 31 days of October 1957. Each day was marked with an X in red pencil, except the 31st. That square was circled in black, and written just beneath it, barely visible through the decay, end of conditioning. The phrase was unfamiliar at the time. No surviving internal documents referenced a formal event under that name. But further analysis of correspondence from that month reveals a sudden cluster of silence. No log entries from facility number 42A exist between October 29th and November 3rd. Shipping manifests, normally recorded weekly, were skipped. No food orders were submitted, no maintenance visits recorded, no correspondence received. Just a 5-day blackout. One partial communication from November 4th was preserved in the Child Welfare Microfiche archive. Sent from an anonymous internal account, it reads, "Protocol adjustment successful. Subsequent resistance will be addressed under Tier 3 isolation. 7R stable. Subjects 9, 10, 11 show signs of erosion. Recommend phase conclusion." The word erosion appears in no other reports from that era. In modern clinical psychology, the term has no standardized meaning when applied to behavior, but in this context, it has been interpreted by analysts as referring to identity fragmentation, the breakdown of self-recognition or linguistic function in controlled subjects. By the end of 1957, 6 children had been reclassified as R. The total known subjects count rose to 34. The most damning evidence of the program's deterioration, however, came not from internal files, but from the breakdown of the language used to describe its operation. Early facility documents had retained a clinical tone, referencing subjects' metrics routines, but starting in mid-1957, notes and memos became increasingly vague. Phrases like non-compliance behavior were replaced with noise events. A July memo submitted by the response technician listed only 2 outcomes under daily objective review. Silence achieved, else stable. Deviation, reorient, or isolate. Words disappeared from the files as they had disappeared from the children. By the time Subject 16's log was updated in August, the only written entry was a black line, drawn through the center of the page. No further data, no initials, no timestamp. What emerged in 1957 was not a singular collapse, but a slow, procedural unraveling. The system had pushed too far, and it began to lose control, not through rebellion, but through the very silence it had enforced. The children had been conditioned to erase themselves, their voices, their names, their reactions. But identity, even buried, does not dissolve. It lingers, it resists, and when it returns, it does so without the language to explain itself. Only instinct, only sound, and that is perhaps what Nolan heard through the vents. Not words, not rebellion, but memory, returning in the only form it could. The calendar, with its black-circled Halloween, became a subject of study in the years that followed. No official report exists to explain what occurred on that date, but in the weeks following October 31st, 1957, the facility's utility logs showed a sharp increase in energy usage. Water consumption dropped. Lighting remained on through the night. 3 children were removed from the records. No reason was given. And then, nothing. By the final week of December, Facility number 42A submitted a requisition order for triple reinforced door hinges and a second lock assembly for the basement level. The order was approved, but the vendor's delivery slip was never signed. The driver's note, handwritten in the margin, read, "No one answered, could hear something humming inside, stayed 5 minutes, left." What makes this chapter of the Hallowmere history so uniquely disturbing is its absence of resolution. No investigation followed, no inquiry was raised. Instead, the silence became policy, the erased ink, the blank files, the crossed-out calendar. These were not accidents. They were the result of an institution slowly forgetting how to speak its own horror aloud. And in that forgetting, the children were buried, not in graves, but in administrative oblivion. The next year, in early 1958, a final audit request would be submitted. It would go unanswered, and the records would stop. In January of 1959, an official notice was issued by the Rhode Island Department of Human Services declaring Facility number 42A, formerly known as Hallowmere Orphanage, non-operational due to structural instability. The language was clinical, without explanation. No safety inspection was cited, no specific hazard was described. Just a brief paragraph confirming that the building would be vacated by March and removed from the active facilities ledger by fiscal year end. The document bore no signatures, only a stamp, closed effective immediately. But the building was never vacated. Residents of Hollows Crossing continued to report lights inside the facility well into the spring. A teacher at the nearby district school recalled walking her dog past the southern fence line on April 3, 1959. She saw children at the window, unmoving, grey uniformed, one hand pressed flat against the glass. "I thought maybe they'd forgotten to take them out," she said, but when I looked again, the curtain had been drawn, slowly. No one in the town was informed of a relocation effort. There were no vans, no buses, no social workers, just silence. Internal correspondence between state officials, later recovered through FOIA litigation in the 1980s, revealed conflicting statements. One memo, dated February 19, 1959, referenced closure protocols initiated, subject handling to proceed via internal framework. A second, dated just 5 days later, contradicted it entirely. No subjects listed for extraction. Transfer reports remained blank. What followed was a bureaucratic limbo. The facility was considered closed on paper, but physically, it remained sealed from the outside, with no record of its contents or its inhabitants being removed. In 1974, a post-retirement memoir was privately published by Gerald A. Wilkes, a mid-level case coordinator who had briefly overseen facility funding during the final years of Hallowmere's operation. In a chapter titled "The Ones We Couldn't Classify," Wilkes described the final audit attempt he conducted in early March of 1959. He never entered the building. "The supervisor on duty told me the children were in quarantine," he wrote, "said they had been for months. I asked what kind of illness. He didn't answer, just said they no longer recognized themselves." Wilkes reported the facility's condition to the DHS later that week, stating, "Subjects exhibit complete behavioural collapse. Recommend termination of programme and surrender of site." His recommendation was ignored. The final funding disbursement to facility number 42A was processed in April. Around the same time, a man named Thomas Minton was contracted to deliver non-perishable food supplies to state-operated youth homes in the region. Hallowmere was one of his stops. He'd been making monthly deliveries since 1956, but on April 18, 1959, something changed. "No one came out," Minton later testified in a sworn statement. "The gates were shut, the door was locked. I waited 20 minutes, knocked twice. The lights were on, but nobody answered." He left the crates of food, 3 days' worth, on the loading dock and drove away. When he returned the next month, the crates were still there. Rats had gotten into the flour. Milk cans had burst open in the sun. He didn't unload. He drove back to the depot and filed a delivery exception. It was his last visit to Hallowmere. State records from the period show no official follow-up to Minton's report. The facility was already listed as inactive, but electrical logs from Narragansett Power tell a different story. Throughout the spring and summer of 1959, Hallowmere continued to draw energy, not just minimal voltage, but sustained power usage consistent with lighting, electric heating, and mechanical ventilation. Water usage slowed but never stopped. Someone or something remained inside. The true horror of Hallomere's closure was not that the system failed to relocate the children. It was that the system had already erased them. By the time the closure notice was filed, the children no longer existed within any formal record. No names, no birthdays, no guardians, no education transcripts, no medical forms. They were not missing, because officially they had never been there. They had been processed, scrubbed, reassigned, and by the end, they were no longer identifiable as children. This phase in the story represents the deepest descent, a quiet disappearance disguised as administrative housekeeping. No raid, no scandal, just a line item removed from a spreadsheet. And yet in the margins of forgotten documents, the truth flickered. A handwritten note attached to a lost facility keycard, recovered in 1996 during demolition efforts, read, "Lower wing remains sealed, no entry after March 20th. Subjects are not to be disturbed." No records explain what lower wing refers to. The original blueprints show only a basement-level storage area, repurposed in 1955 as Tier 3 isolation. The last known mention of that wing comes from a faded maintenance slip from January 1959. The task? Install sound baffles, sub-level corridor, no vent access. The final official action taken in relation to the facility was a one-sentence memo issued on July 8, 1959 by the Office of Institutional Asset Recovery. Property deemed inactive, secure perimeter, post no trespass signage, future demolition to be scheduled. The locks were changed, the fences were reinforced, and no one entered again. What makes this ending particularly chilling is not the thought that the children perished behind sealed doors. It is the deeper, quieter possibility that by the time Hallowmere was closed, there were no children left to save. Only husks, forms, voices that didn't remember how to speak, eyes that no longer recognized themselves. The system had succeeded, not by killing, but by erasing. In the decades that followed, no legal inquiries were made, no lawsuits filed, no parents came forward. Because those identities, once reassigned, once scrubbed, were never traced back to the outside world. The last of them had likely been made unrecognizable long before the doors were locked. By the time crews arrived in 1996 to begin demolition, the upper floors were rotting, the walls caved in, but the basement level remained sealed. When contractors attempted to access it, they found a steel hatch that had been welded shut from the inside. No one questioned it. The blueprints had no mention of the hatch. The team moved on, and Hallowmere was left alone, with its closure unacknowledged and its victims forgotten, Hallowmere became something worse than haunted. It became ignored, and in that silence, the story of its final year was buried, not by secrecy, but by apathy. The next time its name would appear again, even unofficially, would be in a single typed sentence at the top of a 1962 budget reallocation form. Discontinued. No further obligation. In 2003, during the filming of a state-funded documentary on shuttered welfare institutions, a production assistant sorting through retired employee contact sheets came across a penciled note. It listed a name, a phone number, and one line written in slanted cursive. HM Recode. She was the last one to see it. That name was redacted in all subsequent public releases. But in private interviews conducted under strict anonymity agreements, the woman agreed to speak. Her face never appeared on camera. Her voice was digitally altered, but her memory was clear. She had worked as an assistant archivist for the Department of Institutional Records in Providence between 1960 and 1964. Her job, she explained, was simple: organize state facility files into long-term storage. Each file received a barcode, a classification stamp, and, if applicable, a reference index card placed in a central drawer system for rapid retrieval. One drawer stood out from the rest. It was older than the others, painted black, unlike the standard beige. It bore no external labels, only a single strip of white tape across the handle, with 3 letters written in fading blue ink. HM Recode. Inside were index cards, over 40 of them. None had names, just numbers. Each card, she remembered, included a brief typed description. Not diagnostic language, not the usual behavioural summaries or condition codes. These were written as observations. Direct, cold, stripped of all medical pretense. She recited one from memory. No. 18. Exhibited adverse reaction to sound triggers. Eyes covered with cloth. Communication not permitted post-incident. Another. No. 04. Mimicked subject behaviour within 2 meters. Requires spatial isolation. Language test. Negative. And when she paused before reciting. No. 07R. Re-entry condition observed. No corrective protocol available. Observation discontinued. She claimed that, at the time, she had asked her supervisor what recode meant. The answer was one word: stripping. It was not a formal designation, not a legal term, but within the confines of Facility Number 42A, recode referred to a specific classification: children who had been processed through an internal program designed not to treat, but to erase, to strip identity, to dismantle language, to eliminate the capacity for external integration. They were not meant to be adopted, they were not meant to be educated, they were meant to become compliant. The full extent of the program came into view only after a series of confidential documents were released through the Child Behavioural Ethics Reform Act of 1998. In those records, under a redacted project name, believed to be associated with Dr. Aldous Curl, the operation at Hallowmere was described as a pilot study in paediatric environmental recalibration. The term, sanitized and vague, concealed the reality. What Hallowmere had pioneered was a protocol of controlled sensory deprivation, linguistic elimination, and identity negation. The program targeted children classified by the state as non-integrable, a euphemism for those deemed unfit for traditional family placement due to trauma histories, attachment resistance, or neurological instability. They were selected, they were removed, and they were reshaped. Dr. Curl, according to funding proposals submitted between 1950 and 1954, had argued that trauma could be reprogrammed, not by treating it, but by silencing the structures that housed it. The facility's architectural revisions confirmed this approach. Blueprints from 1952 show that a full quarter of the East Wing was rebuilt with soundproof insulation and double-sealed observation doors. Room labels were changed. Classroom A became Stimulus Control Sector. Dormitory 3 became Cohesion Wing. The chapel's lower floor was reclassified as Tier 3 containment, outfitted with steel door latches and interior-facing locks. Each room featured only a chair, a mounted mirror, and a floor drain. There were no windows. Children were stripped of names within their first 48 hours of intake. Meal times were randomized to break temporal association. Food portions were adjusted daily, not for nutrition, but for dependency testing. Language exposure was minimized. Verbal interaction between children was strictly prohibited. Infractions resulted in reflective isolation, an anodyne phrase concealing solitary confinement in pitch-dark rooms for durations ranging from 4 to 12 hours. Those who failed to comply were reassigned. Reassignment meant silence, permanent, procedural, and absolute. The funding trail for Hallowmere's transformation was convoluted by design. Publicly, it was categorized under Pediatric Therapeutic Research Grant 342B, funded jointly by the Rhode Island Office of Youth Services and an unnamed Psychological Development Institute in Boston. Privately, the disbursement sheets list 17 withdrawals by internal academic partners. No credentials, no institutional affiliations, just numerical authorizations. These were the ones who wrote the protocols. These were the ones who came to observe. Never teachers, never social workers, observers. They came every quarter, and they never spoke to the children. One internal memo, recovered from a thermal scanning reconstruction of shredded facility logs, revealed a directive titled Environmental Correction, Phase 4, Full Recoding. The goal, as outlined in the document, was to determine if a child's identity could be eliminated without physical restraint, if silence, isolation, and irregular sensory inputs could disrupt memory recall, if group mimicry could override personal cognition. It was experimentation, concealed behind the facade of care. The woman who remembered the drawer, the one labelled HM Recode, described its destruction. In May of 1964, all records related to facility number 42A were reassigned to long-term inactive housing. She was instructed to oversee the box transfer. But when she returned to the archive room the following morning, the drawer was gone. In its place was a yellow post-it note. 4 words: Destroy per closure protocol. No initials, no timestamp. She never saw the cards again. But even in destruction, fragments remained. Some of the intake labels, missorted, misfiled, were later recovered in boxes mislabeled as Caraway Youth Budget Appeals. Those fragments formed the last known list. They contain the last sentences ever written about those children. What follows is not a list of names, because there were no names left, only numbers, only what they became. They never spoke of them by name, only numbers. Fragmented notes on fragile bodies, stored deep in the locked files under Tier 3, visual auditory non-compliance. Each subject represented a failed attempt to reach something or escape from it. Subject 02 resisted the reorientation protocols with quiet defiance. While most forgot their own names within the first week, this one retained flickers of old language, uttering broken syllables from some half-remembered dialect. They assigned it to visual deprivation, hoping the dark would untangle the memory. It didn't. Another, Subject 06, could not meet the silence quotas. Sound, real or imagined, echoed through his cell. There were suspicions of auditory hallucinations, not the kind born of trauma, but the kind that seemed shared. He was reassigned to Tier 3. The file notes a warning, underlined in red: Monitor proximity decay. 7R wasn't part of the original cohort. It was found post-breach, condition uncorrectable. No one was permitted contact. There is no record of who authorized its containment or why it was allowed to remain. Subject 10 spent days mimicking its own reflection. It would not eat, not speak, only move when its mirrored self did. No one taught it the motions. It was removed from the group cycle when staff began reporting migraines during observation. In one soundproof chamber, Subject 12 whispered to something no one else could hear. The source of the sound was never found. When insulation was reinforced, the whispers grew louder. The note ends abruptly. Baffle reinforcement recommended. They called 14 Echo. It copied everything: faces, voices, even the stillness of others. It had no identity of its own, only stolen fragments. Eventually, the other subjects began copying it. Subject 18 covered its eyes from the moment it was moved inside. It never responded to light, to speech, or to movement. It simply refused. For days it remained rigid, arms crossed, eyes sealed, unmoving. Then there was Subject 22. It responded only to blank stimuli. Empty slides, dark screens, meaningless prompts. No joy, no fear, no rage, just a silent, seated figure. It was marked as successful. Others broke in quieter ways. Subject 30 stopped responding to food. It was isolated. The notes ceased shortly after. 1. Subject 34 collapsed during a group sequence. After that, it was reclassified and quietly transferred. Its new location remains unknown. And finally, Subject 39. No speech, no recognition, no entry log. There is no record of who brought it in or when. It remains unnamed, unclaimed, and unresponsive. Its file ends with 3 words: retain until conclusion. This is what remains of them. Not birth dates, not photographs, not memories. Just observations, just instructions. Clinical facts filed away in a drawer that no longer exists. What Hallowmere took was not life. It took the idea of life. It turned children into variables, into outcomes. And when they could no longer serve their function, they were erased. Not because they failed, but because they remembered. What makes this revelation unbearable is its precision. The cruelty here was not impulsive, not chaotic. It was methodical, measured, conducted beneath fluorescent lights and behind policy terms. And it was funded, approved, filed, buried. By the time the last card was shredded, the program had already declared itself a success. The final report, though redacted, included one surviving line. The recode index is complete. No subjects retained independent markers. In the eyes of its creators, Hallowmere had achieved its goal. The children were blank. What was left behind were bodies, habits, empty routines, but no names. In 2006, a proposal was submitted to install a memorial at the former Hallowmere site. It was denied. There were no victims, the office wrote, no complaints, no death certificates, no proof. Just rumours, just whispers, and one missing drawer. The final scene lies ahead, but what remains now is not justice. It is the echo of absence, a silence built over years, behind walls that no longer stand. Because what they did wasn't hidden by shadow, it was hidden by policy, by procedure, by the kind of evil that wears a white coat and files its paperwork on time. In the spring of 1996, a demolition contract was awarded to Fairbrook Development Group to clear 14 acres of underutilised state land in northern Rhode Island. The site had been vacant for decades. Records listed it simply as Parcel 412B, former youth welfare facility. It had no name, but the workers called it something else: Hallowmere. The plan was straightforward: level the remaining structure, clear the foundation, and prepare the soil for a suburban housing development. The company projected a 6-week timeline. Heavy machinery arrived on April 11th. By April 13th, the crew had walked off the job. Official logs cite 3 separate injuries in 2 days. The first, a backhoe operator, suffered a compound fracture to his wrist when the controls locked and jerked the machine backwards into a retaining wall. The second, a foreman received a deep gash to the thigh while attempting to cut through the chapel's basement door frame. His report stated the blade seized against the metal as if something was pulling it inward. The third, a structural engineer, collapsed in the southern corridor, later diagnosed with acute stress response. His only statement, written shakily on an incident card, was 4 words: they were looking out, No further explanation was recorded. After a brief delay, demolition resumed the following week, but only above ground. Crews refused to enter the basement. A subcontractor hired for internal prep work quit before completing the first walkthrough. In his report, filed with the city clerk, he wrote, "You could feel it in your teeth, like the building was holding its breath." By May 2nd, the project was suspended indefinitely. No press release, no city hearing. The equipment was removed quietly, and Hallowmere was left standing. By 1999, the proposal to repurpose the land had been withdrawn entirely. Developers cited subsurface anomalies and material instability, but no environmental studies were published. No local news outlets ran the story. It was as if the building had been forgotten, not condemned and not protected, just excluded. Today, if you walk the unmarked path that leads through the trees, you can still see it. The brickwork is fractured, but solid. The windows are gone, yet their frames remain intact, like hollow sockets. Ivy climbs the western facade in thick ropes. The eastern stairwell is collapsed, its concrete shredded by frost and time. And yet the foundation hasn't shifted. The southern wall hasn't bowed, despite 60 winters, despite storm and moss and rot. The shell of Hallowmere still stands. Not because it is strong, but because no one has dared to finish the job. No investigation was ever reopened. No review was ordered. The state classified the property as abandoned infrastructure, not eligible for public redevelopment. A bureaucratic tombstone, and beneath it nothing was disturbed. No excavation, no forensic study, no attempt to document the past. The children who once lived there, if they can be called that anymore, remain unnamed in every official archive. Their records were purged, their files destroyed. Even their numbers, those final, dehumanizing codes, have vanished from the Department of Child Welfare's master database. Only the foundations of their containment remain. And even those, most people won't find, because most people stopped looking. What makes this ending so unbearable isn't the lack of justice. It's the lack of noise. There was no outrage, no lawsuits, no documentaries aired on public access television, no interviews with grieving parents, because no parents ever came forward. No one asked what happened, no one demanded answers, and so no one gave any. The land records list the structure as non-operational youth facility. The tax code identifies it as government-owned, no market value. And yet if you access declassified Department of Planning satellite archives, you'll find one aerial image, taken in October 2001, just before the leaves turned. The building, though crumbling, is still perfectly recognisable from above. The courtyard paths are overgrown, but their pattern remains. The outline of the observation wings, symmetrical, clinical, efficient, is undisturbed. From the air, Hallowmere appears almost beautiful. A design without blemish, a shape without flaw. It is only when you stand inside that the sickness returns. Inside, the air is heavy. The walls sweat with rot, but it's not abandonment that defines it. It's something else. A feeling that what was done there didn't end. It was simply put down, like a tool, like something waiting to be picked up again. The truth of Hallowmere's horror was never supernatural. There are no curses here, no legends of vengeful spirits or haunted halls, only silence. Silence so complete it became institutional. And in that silence, a cruelty far worse than violence took root, because violence ends, but silence sustains. Silence allows memory to fade. It allows names to be forgotten, and children, once erased, do not return. They vanish entirely. No memorial stands on the site, no plaque, no stone, nothing that says, "This happened." Because officially, it didn't. The programs weren't real, the rooms didn't exist, the cards were never filed, and the names, the real ones, if they were ever written down, are gone. But one name does remain, or rather, one word, found in a wall, preserved in dust and brick, written in a child's unsteady hand, on lined paper, folded into an envelope. Just 5 words. Please don't let them take my name again. signed simply Miriam. There is no record of Miriam in any state registry, no adoption record, no birth certificate, no disappearance file. There is no Miriam, only Subject 3. And maybe that's why the building still stands. Not out of defiance, but as evidence. Not haunted, just buried, quiet, forgotten, but still there, waiting.